Welcome back to COVID class. I'm Dr. Devin Fisher.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Taylor Newton. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, we're excited about this week and looking forward to being a little bit absurd with all of you. Um, I think it's a good time for a transition this week.
Exactly. So we've spent the last few weeks learning from the health sciences and the biological sciences. And last week we started to dip our toes a little bit into the social sciences. So Dr. Fisher and I are super excited today to welcome experts in the field of humanities, which is a disciplinary area that I think is aptly named, right? It's about finding the humanness in all of this. Dr. Fisher is going to give us a brief overview of this evening, and then we'll jump right into introducing you to our guests.
Sure. So if you've been here with us the past few weeks or any of the weeks that we've been running the class, we'll follow kind of a similar format. Our featured speaker will have 10, maybe 15 minutes at the beginning to expand upon, add to, retract statements from the materials that were posted for us in the Canvas site. And following that, we will turn to a little bit of Q&A from the panel here before opening things up for those of you who are out there as participants in the webinar. And we really, really invite your questions. I think those are the ones that make this unique. I love having conversation with my colleagues here, but that's something I can do. I was going to say I could do it all the time, but we have to arrange Zoom meetings now because of COVID-19. But we do get a lot of chance to talk together, and your questions really are what make this a unique, kind of a special experience for all of us. So really invite those questions in the Q&A line. Do remind you that you may see a raise hand function. I can't remember if we turned that off this week or not, but that's one that because we're not opening up the Zoom webinar for verbal comments and questions, please use the Q&A and we'll work those in as we can. We will stop promptly at 8 o'clock. So each week so far, we've had some really great questions that we did not get to. And please don't take that as a sign that your question wasn't good or that we're ignoring it. It's simply, we have a lot of questions rolling in and we try to work them into the best that we can. So Dr. Noon is going to introduce for us our featured speakers tonight.
Sure. So let's start with a familiar face, hopefully for you by now. Dr. Gary Johnson has a bachelor's and PhD degrees in comparative literature from UNC Chapel Hill with a particular interest in narrative theory. He spent 12 years in Northwest Ohio at the University of Findlay, first as a faculty member and then as a dean. He spent the next 6 years as the provost of Hastings College in Nebraska. June 18th is his 2-year anniversary as provost here at LR, and he's excited to be back here on the East Coast. His wife, Emily, and he have 2 children. His son, Chase, will be headed to Duke next year, and daughter, Madeline, will be in 10th grade at Hickory High School. I think it's also worth noting that Dr. Johnson, when Dr. Fisher and I first developed the class, is the one who said yes. And when we asked him, can we offer it for free to LR students, he said yes. And then when we asked him, can we open it to the community, he said yes. So thank you, Dr. Johnson, for joining us here tonight and for saying yes to this class. And our other guest this evening is Dr. Mindy Makant. She has a bachelor's in Spanish, which I just learned, that's so cool, and a master's in education and language acquisition. She describes her life as having 2 parts. So in her first adult life, she was a high school Spanish teacher. And then after 10 years of teaching and another 10 years at home with small children, she received her master's in theology and a doctor of theology in theology and ethics from Duke Divinity School, Most of her research and writing has been in narrative theology. So we have comparative literature with a focus on narrative, and we have a narrative theologian here with us. She's written 2 books, one of which is The Practice of Story, and the other is Holy Mischief. She's beginning her 9th year at Lenore Ryan this fall. She's an associate professor of religious studies and the director of the Living Well Center for Vocation and Purpose. She is also, in addition to all of that, a deacon in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and her husband is a pastor in the ELCA. They have 2 amazing adult-ish children, both of whom went to LR and graduated from LR. And I'll just throw in there, she's also one of the loveliest people that you could ever hope to have a conversation with, just crammed full of earnestness and conviction. And I'm so thrilled to join both of them here tonight in conversation. Dr. Johnson is going to get us started by giving us a little bit of a background, and then we'll jump right into a conversation.
Great, thank you, Dr. Newton and Dr. Fisher. I have to say it's easy to say yes when you're working with folks like you. So I appreciate all the work that you've done in putting this together. And Mindy, Dr. Makant, thank you for joining us. It's good to have someone else who's interested in narrative. So what I thought I would do with my time at the beginning is to recap a little bit what I was trying to do in the Zoom sessions that I posted earlier, both for those who did not have a chance to see those, but also as a way to kind of, for me to run back through what I was looking to accomplish, and then hopefully open it up for lots of good questions. I think that'll be probably the more interesting part of the evening. So my interest is in narrative. So really for me, trying to kind of create stories to put plot pieces together is something that I'm very interested in. So looking back at a relationship such as literature and pandemics is an interesting topic. I'm sorry that we only have 1 week to do this. This could be an entire course in its own right. And so it was really a challenge to think about how do you pare this down, as well as address the topic for the evening, which is grappling with the absurd. So that's a lot. And I did try to cram quite a bit into those Zoom recordings, but let's see if we can recap it a little bit and then open it up for discussion. As I pointed out, there's a long history between literature and pandemics, and I think for a couple of good reasons. One, obviously, humankind has been beset by pandemics for really as long as we have history, and because of that, there are some interesting stories buried in there. They get at the core of who we are, how we respond to things, what we think about when we are faced with something that is literally life-threatening, and not just to an individual, but to an entire group of people. In some cases, almost entire countries. I noted that the bubonic plague, when Boccaccio was writing, wiped out about 70% of his native Florence. So when you're dealing with things on that level and of that seriousness, it really does focus what a writer might be able to do in terms of addressing the human condition. So I think that's one reason that authors are tempted by this subject matter of pandemics. The second reason, and this led into my discussion of allegory, I think there's a lot of allegorical potential with the idea of pandemics, because it allows for an author to indicate that there is something very, very wrong, and not just in a very targeted way, but generally wrong. There is a problem that is rampant in a society or in a culture, and that can be represented by the idea of a pandemic, a plague, a pestilence, whatever term you want to use for that. So I think there's a lot of potential for that pandemic or plague to represent something. As we saw in the piece on Camus, in the preparatory material, it might represent something like communism. It could represent general decay or decadence within a society. There are really any number of things that an author can use the idea of a pandemic to represent that would indicate that there is an issue that a society or a culture needs to deal with. And there are quite a few examples of that throughout literary history. From there, I tried to move into the difference between writing about a pandemic and living in one. And this is really where we start to, I think, have the opportunity to talk about the idea of the absurd, because I think there's a very big difference in stepping back and looking as an author and writing about a pandemic, perhaps using it allegorically, versus the situation that we face now, which is being in the midst of a pandemic. Because I do think it does things to us that make our lives very challenging, and it makes it very challenging to make sense of our lives when so many of the things that we've become accustomed to have been disrupted. I do believe, and this is one of the reasons that I studied narrative for many years, I do believe that as human beings, we have a desire, a craving to make sense of our worlds and to make sense of our lives. And we partly do that by ordering our lives, ordering our paths in a kind of narrative fashion. But we also do it by trying to make meaning and trying to understand how our lives have significance in this world. The idea of the absurd is when reality or the world in which we live does not allow for us to make that connection, to make the connection between the significance of our lives and something greater. And I tried to argue in some of those early materials that you had the chance to see that many of the structures that we rely on to give our lives meaning are disrupted in a pandemic such as the one that we are facing now. We think about our ability to be with family and friends, our ability to worship in the way that we're typically used to worshiping, our ability to go about our lives in just the regular routine ways that we have grown accustomed to is disrupted. Our ability to go to school, in many cases, our livelihoods, our jobs are threatened. So all of these things that we have tied ourselves to, all of the ways that we try to make meaning and add significance to our lives are called into question. And that in some ways is why I feel that the idea of the absurd is a relevant one here. And that is why I included in the readings the Kafka pieces, as well as the discussion of the play No Exit. Kafka in particular, I think is brilliant at pointing out sometimes the challenge of finding meaning in the world. I think you see that in An Imperial Message as well as Before the Law, where in both cases the protagonist of those very short, I think allegorical tales is frustrated by an inability to find meaning or gain access to something that could potentially provide meaning for him or her. So I think we have that absurdity on the individual level. How does my life make sense? But I think we also are seeing it more and more on a social level, on the societal level these days. I think the pandemic, in some very real sense, has been a straw that has broken the camel's back. I think we've already called into question a lot of the institutions that for many, many years we have used to derive meaning. Think about politics, think about justice, think about law, education. I think over the last few decades, there's been an undermining of these institutions and the faith that many people have in them. And we might talk about religion as well with Dr. Makant here. I think that falls into the same bucket. And with this pandemic, I think it has really almost pushed us over an edge, because not only do we see real significant gaps in our justice system, real significant gaps in our healthcare system, real significant gaps in our government. Where do we find meaning? Where do we put our faith these days? I think these are questions that writers like Kafka bring up, 100 years later, still very, very timely, and give us the opportunity to think about these things. And I think not necessarily only in a negative way, not just in a pessimistic way, but can help us think about, all right, well, what do we need to do to make things better? So I'll stop with that, and we can go to questions if you'd like. I think you're muted there.
That was absurd. Uh, that's a lot of very heavy concepts, Dr. Johnson. I'm going to confess my lack of expertise in this area. So I know the metamorphosis. I know the bug story, like from high school, but like other than that, the absurdist literature. This was one of my first forays into really trying to engage with it. Was the material that you posted. So thank you for challenging me to grow in that way. And I guess I kind of wanted to start maybe with a little bit more familiarity. In that NPR story that you posted, there was this line from an author who, contemporary author named Karen Thompson Walker. She wrote a book called The Dreamers, and there's this line in it that just really struck me. She said, "This is how the sickness travels best, through all the same channels as do fondness and friendship and love." And that struck me as so poignant. Can you talk a little bit more about how literature can kind of shed a light on what has happened to our social relationships? This is something that will come up again later in the class. Dr. Ryan Lurs is going to join us and talk about social connection. But I wonder if, as a comparative literature guy, could you help us to kind of deal with that disruption in our social lives?
Well, I do think it is great material for literary fiction, and I think that's one of the things that actually fiction can do for us, even in a time of pandemic like this. It does allow us access to thinking and feeling empathetically, because we have, characters that authors have provided for us, for example, who are undergoing stresses that we may be facing now, and dealing with them in ways either that are familiar to us or that might provide us with opportunities to think about things in a different way. I'm actually rereading the novel Blindness, which I mentioned in my material, written by Jose Saramago. And I struggled with it when I first read it, because it for some reason it wasn't really resonating with me. It does in a very different way now, because of what we're going through, and it enables me to see the relationships that the author is building in very different ways, in ways that I hadn't thought about when I wasn't reading it in the midst of a pandemic.
So do you feel, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think outside of literature, I do think the pandemic is forcing us to think about our social relationships in very different ways, and is putting a lot of stress on a lot of our social relationships. It's from two perspectives. One, in some cases, we find ourselves very close with, an immediate family group, for example, and that was one of my tongue-in-cheek hell is other people references, because you can't get away from these people, right? And they no matter how much you love them, they may annoy you from time to time. Anyone who has kids get under each other's skin, and it's natural, but when you're in such close quarters for so long, I think it happens a little bit more frequently. But beyond that, for those that were not sheltered in place with, it's made it very difficult to maintain physical connection. And you may be just down the road, but you can't see each other necessarily. And ironically, absurdly, perhaps the greatest expression of love that you can show to some of those people is not to see them, right? Because you may be putting them at risk, or you may be putting yourself at risk. So I do think it's forced us to look at relationships in very different ways. I don't think it has to be negative. I think, we may be able to find that we do appreciate those relationships in ways that we don't recognize when we can take them for granted. And I think that can be a good thing. But it is very challenging.
You used the word empathy, which I thought was so interesting as a way of thinking what literature can give to us. Have you found, you or Dr. Makant, have you found a playbook for all this in literature? Have you found the people that you want to be more like and the people that you want to be less like?
I'll let Dr. Makant chime in after. No is the simple answer. It's interesting. I tend to be attracted to, fiction that is not always all that uplifting. And I don't know why, because I'm actually a very positive person. So I don't mind reading pandemic related fiction, but I think it is because of the empathy piece. For me, there's something very powerful about putting myself in the situation of someone who is suffering, or someone who's really struggling with something, maybe in ways that I never have had to or won't, but it allows me to see things from a different perspective. So I get it's hard to find on my bookshelves books with happy endings, and that's okay, because my life, I feel like my regular life is happy, so I balance it out with other things.
Dr. Makant, do you go? Oh, sorry, I was going to ask if she goes dark too, and what you read for fun.
No, I don't go dark. That's actually not, I can't actually. I hadn't thought about your question until you just asked it. And my immediate thought is actually young adult literature. I don't have a particular text that I would name as saying, oh, that's who I aspire to be in this time. But I do think that a lot of some of the best literature that's written, just fiction, is written for young adults. I mean, it just has to have something to do with how difficult of an audience that is to get through to. So the people that do it well really do it well, and they get at the heart of so many human issues. Coming of age stories really don't end because we turn 18. And so the coming of age narratives of young adults, whether it's Lois Lowry or even Madeline L'Engle. I mean, you think of so many of the Bridge to Terabithia, whose name I can't pull up the author's name at this moment as I'm thinking of it, but so many of the young adult stories, they do help you develop empathy. I mean, I think that the empathy is important. They help us learn to see things from completely different perspectives, and they focus on development of character and resilience and strength. And so if we can focus stories on resilience building, that seems like, at least it seems to me like that becomes a helpful way of allowing literature to help frame, even if they have nothing to do with a pandemic, right? I mean, if it's overcoming, I mean, take the allegory of pandemic, it's overcoming something else. It's not just the actual literal pandemic we're living in, it's the trials and tribulations of being 12. And so, how authors write that well, I think can help all of us.
That's interesting that you mentioned young adult literature, because one of the books that I've really enjoyed reading during this pandemic, I've got several project books that I'm working on. I've got The Brothers Karamazov, which I've never read, and I'm just kind of very slowly going through that one. But the one that I picked up and went, ooh, this will grab my attention, is Suzanne Collins' most recent book, the prequel to the Hunger Games, and reading through it, just kind of thinking, I know this was not written during a pandemic, but oh my gosh, how it aligns with the social structure and the way in which we treat other people and the disproportionate effects that something has on District 12 as compared to the Capitol. It just all felt like it worked. It actually leads into a question that we've got here on the YouTube channel from, and I'll try to get the name right, it's Rob, I think, Leluski. Rob asks, you speak about classical literature that is a model of discussing pandemics of the past. Who do you believe will be the COVID era authors who will be held up as models from our own pandemic?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And I have no idea, to be honest with you, but what will be very interesting, I think, is to see what comes out of our current situation. I think both in terms of the pandemic, but also the social issues that we're facing now with Black Lives Matter and the riots. I think there's a lot of material. I think if you're a creative writer, to bring this moment the pieces of things that we're dealing with together, there's a lot of potential there. So I would anticipate that there are some younger writers, particularly, you know, in their 20s or 30s, who are going to really be able to make some interesting connections between some of the things that are going on now and the way we're responding to them.
You know, Gary, you brought up Black Lives Matter, and it seems to be a theme that we keep coming back to, societal inequities. You had us read a short story by Poe, right, The Mask of the Red Death. And one of the lessons, it seems, if you want to impose a lesson on a horror writer, is that none are untouched, right? So whatever sense of control we think we have, we actually don't. And there's this line in there: the prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, is that how you pronounce that? There were ballet dancers, musicians, there was beauty with a capital B, there was wine. That seems important. And all of these in security were within, and without was the Red Death, right? So there's this idea that the characters in that story thought that they could control their fate. And for people who are in privileged positions during the current pandemic, whether it's privilege because of our socioeconomic status, or privilege because of the color of our skin, or because of our health status, or because of our age, some people really do seem to have a measure of control, insulation from what's happening to so many others. The plague, in this case, isn't meting out justice for us like it did in Mask of the Red Death, at least not so far. I can't say I'm hoping for the plague to mete out justice, as much as justice seems to be a good goal. I'm not hoping that the plague is going to do that for us. But the allegory isn't as neat in our lived experience. Do you think that there's still lessons that we can learn from a story like The Mask of the Red Death, even if it doesn't map super perfectly onto how it's playing out today?
Yes, and actually I think the Mask of the Red Death in some ways works as well or better for us in terms of taking a message from it, if you take the pandemic question out of it completely. Because I think in that case, you know, really it's tempting to read it now, or to go back and reread it now, because it is a story that uses the idea of an illness or a pandemic to make a point. But I don't think it's really necessarily making a point about this pandemic. I think it's making a point about a decadent, privileged, moneyed class and approach to life, and you know, the illusion that that group can wall itself off from everything else and make itself impervious to illness or threat. And what you see, I think, in that story is that threat, that illness, is already inside, and it's personified as the plague or the Red Death. But I don't think it has to be that. I think in that case, I do think it's, you know, that's an allegory. It is a story that uses illness or the plague as a way to make a larger point. I think that larger point is perfectly applicable today, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a point about the plague. I think it's just a point about society and about our class distinctions. And I think in some ways it's as relevant to that question of justice and Black Lives Matter, and, you know, who has access to healthcare and who has access to the, you know, justice and law, going back to Kafka. So I think it really does. It's a story that makes you think, but it doesn't necessarily make you think about, well, what does it mean to live within this pandemic? I think it's more about class and status and privilege.
I see we lost Dr. Fisher there momentarily, but happily I wanted to keep talking about exactly this issue with both Dr. Makant and you, Dr. Johnson. So like the infection is within, the illness is within. That's such an interesting idea. And Dr. Johnson, before you talked about how this seems to be the straw that's broken the back in a lot of ways. So many of our systems, education, politics, communication, as we explored last week, for those of you who were with us last week. So what is our response then? Can we draw lessons from literature for change or die seems to be the message of the Masque of the Red Death. Maybe it's a moral death too, or a death of the soul or something like that. So what can we do? So if this is our call, then what do we do?
I think it's a good question. I'll be curious to see what Dr. Makant has to say as well. But for me, as I indicated earlier, I'm generally a fairly optimistic, hopeful person, and despite the books on my shelves, and despite this topic, and despite everything that we're struggling with right now, I think it is an opportunity. I do think we have an opportunity to look at our social structures, to look at those institutions that for in the past may have nourished us, may have provided us with a sense of security, maybe not always for everybody. And I think that's one of the things that we are seeing now, healthcare, government, law, justice, education has not always worked for everybody. And I think it's really critical that we realize that now and have an opportunity to think about how we can do better. So this is a really tough time right now, from being socially distant to people losing jobs, to the questions about even for all of us, what is the fall going to look like, right? What are we going to be able to do? But I also think it's an opportunity for us to think about how we can do things better. What can we learn? How can we continue to find meaning, make meaning in these very challenging times? It reminds me of there was a famous, well, maybe not famous, but a story from Kafka where he was talking with his friend and literary executor Max Brod, and Brod had read much of Kafka's work and had the logical questions. So Franz, is there no hope? Your stuff is so depressing. And Kafka replied, there's plenty of hope. There's an infinite amount of hope in the universe, just not for us. Right? So that's kind of the Kafka absurd. I don't believe that. I do think there's a lot of hope for us, and I think we have an opportunity here to learn and to do better. And I think I personally feel like literature, the humanities, are ways that we can learn from some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. We can learn to appreciate other people. We can learn to empathize. And if we can take some lessons from what we're experiencing now, I think we can be better going forward. That's my hope anyway.
Do you have that hope, Dr. Makant?
I do. I think it's interesting to think about meaning making maybe in the midst of this. And I'm kind of two minds kind of at the same time. I mean, on the one hand, I think that some of our worst theology comes when we try to force meaning out of something where perhaps it's not, I don't want to say it's not there, but it's not there the way we think that it is. And so we try to create a meaning and we ascribe meaning to things that maybe isn't there. So you end out, and I realize that saying this, there will be plenty of people that would argue against this, but the language of this happens for, everything happens for a reason, or it's all in God's plan. And I think we end up trying to create meaning that's not only not valid, it's poor theology, which actually then can do real harm to people. I mean, I think poor theology isn't just a question of it doesn't match certain sets of doctrines, it's that it can do real harm to real life human beings, and actually can perpetuate injustice, right? When we think through. So I think the creating meaning is tricky, or trying to force meaning into what might be an absurd situation. And I actually love that Dr. Johnson's using the language of the absurd with the pandemic. That's actually one of the ways that we can talk about sin and evil in a world that's, and I know that Dr. Shore will talk about theodicy in a couple of weeks. And one of the one of the theological arguments about sin and evil is that it's absurd. It's a mathematical, irrational thing. It should not be. In a good world created by a good God, this pandemic should not be. And yet here it is. And so what we do with that becomes important. But where I think it matters is recognizing how absolutely fallible we are at creating meaning looking forward. And what we're a little bit more able to do is to see meaning when we're looking from retrospectively, right? At some imaginary future point in time, we might be able to narrate what's happening now in a way that we can then see some meaning in it. But it's just a little trickier to impart it in a prospective way without just really getting into some slippery land theologically, to me. And so I do think it matters a lot. And I think that the pandemic, the timing of it, Black Lives Matter coming up right now, is maybe a good that will come out of it. Because I think part of why that's become a not more important narrative by any means, but a narrative that's gotten more public attention right now is because we have so many competing narratives and the world's not making sense to people. And we're trying so hard to find meaning in multiple competing narratives. The pandemic has called into question kind of the meta narratives that people already had constructed, and that opens a space to maybe call into question some larger social injustices as well. But I just think we're better off making the meaning retrospectively than we are prospectively, I guess.
I was struck this spring when our academic calendar was totally disrupted by COVID-19. It's a disruption of a narrative, but I was teaching a first-year experience course where we were focused on children's literature. And I thought, what better thing to do as we move into this fully online space than to ask the students to create children's books that help to make sense of the COVID-19 crisis. And I was really struck by the power of some of those narratives. And a big shout out to a couple of my FYE students who I saw register for the class. I don't know if you're here tonight, but if you are, y'all did a great job. But this sense of using narrative to create meaning out of events that don't seem to add up. Dr. Makant, you kind of talked about that, but I wonder if we can dig into this a little bit more. How do we keep those narratives from doing damage, in the sense that maybe they're obscuring reality? And I think this ties into a question that I think it was John Hall asked on the Q&A. Speaking of disrupting narratives, for some reason, my computer decided it was going to restart right in the middle of our webinar. And as a result of that, all of the questions that were in the Q&A are lost to my screen. I understand they're still available to Dr. Newton, so I'm going to hope she comes in with us. But if it was John who I'm remembering, the question was whether, is there the possibility that the political moves that are happening right now are themselves narratives, ways of trying to gain control over a situation where our politicians don't have control? And I think the specific one was the potential of being required to wear masks, going to the teaser at the end of your fourth lecture segment. And just interested in responses to that. I'll throw that out as a topic of conversation.
Well, I guess I would start by saying I think it's absolutely the case that narrative can be used for good or ill. And I think one of the things that we have struggled with historically is control of the narrative. And you hear that in political contexts and campaigns all the time, right? Who controls the narrative? And that often means it's uncoupled with reality. And so, if you control the narrative, in many ways, you do have power. And so it is not necessarily simply a good thing to create a narrative, even one that's created, retrospectively. So I think that it is potentially problematic. And I do think we are, in a current situation where that ability to create stories that gain traction, that go viral, that convince people, or allow people to remain convinced of what they already believe is a really powerful and potentially dangerous thing. So, you know, in a lot of ways, I do think that controlling narratives is both a scary thing, but also potentially a good thing if used well. And that, you know, because telling stories can mean almost anything. And if you can tell a story in such a way that you can convince somebody to do something or to believe something or to act on something, you know, from that kind of rhetorical standpoint, it does have the potential to change things for the better, to help people, but it also has the opposite potential as well.
It's like if Spider-Man was a storyteller, right? So with great power comes great responsibility.
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah, and it is a little scary. Now, I was joking with some of our science faculty, actually, because we were trying to figure out, okay, how are you going to do labs this coming year? Because we're going to have to be socially distant. We're going to have to maintain that 6 feet. We're not going to be able to have as many people together for as long as you typically have in a lab setting. And, you know, as we were talking, I was like, you know, do we really even need to do this? You know, nobody believes in that science stuff anymore anyway. It's all about stories. It's all about narratives. And, you know, I was only half joking. It is kind of a scary situation, you know, even as someone who's studied narrative, how powerful narrative has become and the control of narrative has become. It does scare me a little bit.
Does good narrative tap into truth? Is that one of the things that makes it good?
Well, you would hope that if it doesn't tap in, I mean, if it's a fictional narrative, I don't think it has to tap into truth, but I think it needs to speak to something that enables us to be better or to understand things from a perspective that's going to help us be better.
So there was a question in the Q&A that had come up that Dr. Fisher had alluded to earlier. So John Hall asked, reflecting on Jean-Paul Sartre or Sartre's?
You can say it either way, really.
Cool. I'll go with Sartre.
And someone who is a native French speaker would probably tell us that both of those are incorrect, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, maybe I'll just keep my mouth shut then. That dude, the pessimistic dude, he said that there were views of all of us needing validation, and then you had that idea about masks. And do you think that our governor's consideration of mandating masks is his way of seeking validation of his interpretation of the pandemic, and controversial restrictions that kind of follow up on that?
Honestly, I don't know. It's hard. I can't get into the mind of the governor. I would hope that the governor, and I believe this is probably the case, is being driven by the science. I do still have faith in science, and you know, I think most of our scientific community is in agreement that, you know, wearing masks has the potential to mitigate the spread of the virus. I think there's always a political undercurrent, or it seems like there has been to the whole mask thing. And so I don't want to downplay that or, you know, say it doesn't exist. So I'm sure there's some political aspect to it, but I would hope, and I think probably it's largely driven by a belief in what the science is saying.
Some narratives trump other narratives.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm wearing a mask.
Same here.
I wonder if we can shift to a question that we were kind of chatting about just as we were waiting for folks to get into the webinar. And in some ways, I think it goes back to what Rob asked earlier as well, which I'm still kind of thinking through. Who do I think would be the people who are our model literary figures in this age of pandemic? But one of the things that any writing about the current pandemic is going to take into account for sure is the social media aspect of it. So Dr. Newton and I were chatting earlier about the fact that in a digital age, do we feel the impact of this pandemic differently, and does it lead us to tell the stories differently? So when we read in the litany, what is the title of it? The Litany of a Plague?
Litany in the time of plague.
Litany in
Yeah.
the time of plague. Thank you. I am sick. I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. And then, you know, that's a person who's feeling this intense emotion, clearly from having close connections with people who have died from a plague or who have been affected by it. Now we have 122,000 people have died from the pandemic in the United States. And on the one hand, that is horrific. On the other hand, that distances. Like I cannot wrap my head around 122,000 people. So that number becomes a way of keeping me apart from it. How does that social media, that digital reality, shape the story that we tell, and maybe the way in which, Dr. Makant, I'm really interested in hearing this from a theological perspective as well. How does it change the thinking from that perspective, the desire to connect, to be compassionate? I'm not quite sure what the question is, but it's a really interesting idea.
So if, are you asking me to address it first? Is that all right then?
Go for it.
All right. Well, I mean, the biggest challenge, I'm not really sure how to address it. I guess the biggest challenge theologically is, as a Christian theologian, as a person of faith, in a tradition that's very focused on incarnation, I'm not quite sure what and that becomes kind of the prevailing narrative, is what does incarnation mean? And how do we live out incarnation in our day-to-day lives, both as communities of, I mean, if you take seriously, as I really do, St. Paul in 1 Corinthians call that well, it's not really a call. He tells us we are told you are the body of Christ. And if I could do like a really sloppy one sentence summary of the entirety of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, it's you're the body of Christ, doggone it, act like it. And if we can't gather, then that challenges that. I mean, I don't think it becomes impossible, but it makes us reframe what that means. We've always understood, we as church collectively, and it's not just for Christians, this is true for other people of faith too. So for the Jewish tradition and in Islam, the gathering together and being a community of faith in person is an important part, not only of the narrative, but of how we form ourselves as who we are. It becomes a part of our formation. And liturgy becomes such an important part. I mean, part of how we tell the story is a liturgical year, right? We tell the story repeatedly every Sunday or every time we worship, and we have a calendar that cycles through a liturgical year so that we're shaped by a particular story of faith. But that calendar, it depends upon us being in person together in a place for the liturgy to translate. It just doesn't translate the same way in this virtual world, and it doesn't translate the same way when we're not physically together. And so trying to learn how to tell that same story and to live into a story where all of the rules are different, where all of the pieces have been, the furniture is totally rearranged, and yet the story is the same. And so how do we try to figure out what that looks like, I think is one of our biggest challenges. And I don't know if that really addresses your question exactly or not, but I do think theologically incarnation becomes really an interesting. So as just an example, one question that's come up in more high church liturgical traditions, so for Lutherans, but also for Catholics, for Episcopalians, where Eucharist is a really central part to what we do, that's part of the story. And we can't gather together. How do we share it? How do we share in the Eucharist? And some people are trying to do Eucharist virtually, but that raises its own set of theological questions, is what happens when we do it virtually? And trying to just think through, there's a lot of theological questions that our collective theology isn't really, it doesn't make space for a pandemic. We weren't ready for it, right? Theologically, we're not ready for this. And so now trying to make meaning theologically out of a pandemic includes things like, what do you do as the body of Christ when you can't receive the body of Christ because you can't be gathered together? It has a body. And so
So what do you do? I mean, so like you're a deacon in the ELCA and your spouse is a pastor. So like what has that looked like for your religious community these last months?
Well, on a practical level, it's an awful lot like academia, right? So our house looks like multiple stations of computers and tripods and cameras and sound equipment. And we have a creek in our backyard. So sometimes we go outside and try to record worship by the creek, but then the neighbor starts mowing his grass or somebody's kid runs in the woods in the background. I mean, so it doesn't really, in that really practical sense, it's no different than academia. It's how do you learn to move everything online. But people, in a way that's really different, people die and people still have to be buried. People get hospitalized and pastoral care still needs to happen. So there's a more acuteness to the need, I think, within the church. And one of the, I think, biggest challenges is most congregations do have a predominantly older population. So if you're just looking at risk populations, churches on the whole tend to be pretty high at-risk communities of people. And yet some of those folks who are most at risk are most in want and in need of a physical regathering. And so that challenge of how do you try to meet the needs of people faithfully, but not put them at risk. And so then the competing narratives of science and faith, which aren't really competing, but can seem to be at times, and which one, and then you add to that the narrative of politics, which I do think can compete with the narratives of science and faith in ways that aren't helpful. It just makes it's a real challenge. I mean, I think it is the same challenge that we have as a university, but in some ways multiplied. And I mean, pastors like professors are learning all sorts of new things about technology, and maybe we learn some things that actually are better moving forward. But in the meantime, there's some real growing pains and some real pain involved in it.
Gotcha. Something that I think Dr. Makant and Dr. Johnson have both dealt with is like this idea of abiding in absurdity. Like it's absurd that we still have to bury people and there's a camera and like, can y'all reflect on your absurd moments? So like the times when you're just like, and I'm done.
For me, some of it is really just involved in the planning for, what are we going to do going forward, and how do we keep people safe, and at the same time, is it really going to have the impact that we want it to have and need it to have? Dr. Fisher and I were in a meeting this morning, and he made he asked the question that I think needed to be asked, which was, are we going to have to teach our college students how to go to the bathroom in a socially responsible way?
I was thinking exactly that moment when Dr. Newton asked the question of where is your absurd moment? It was there, right?
That is an absurd question, but it's absurd because it needs to be asked. I mean, if you've ever been in a men's restroom on a college campus, by the end of the day, there's probably some COVID-19.
Oh, Dr. Makant, I'm feeling grateful that I am not privy to. Oh, I just used the word privy. That's funny.
So yeah, it's and then you're literally walking around classrooms with a yardstick, seeing how far can you keep people apart, and knowing you can only control them while they're in that classroom, right? You have no control over what happens outside or what decisions they make. It does kind of get you into that Sartre realm of it's other people, right? And we're dependent on them to help us kind of do what we need, what we want to do and what we need to do, and to see things in the way we need to see them, but we can't control them. And that, so I do think as we're planning for what happens in the future, there's absurdity every day in that, really.
It really brings fresh meaning to the hell is other people.
What about for you, Dr. Makant, the absurd moment?
Well, I can't come up with one that's actually better than that.
Oh, the gauntlet is thrown. I can't wait.
No, I mean, it's odd because there's moments when I feel like this, we you just want to wake up one day and you realize, well, I wake up every morning almost since this started, and I kind of for just a moment don't remember, right? Like for just a moment, there's that I have to think when I first wake up. I get up early. When I first wake up, my thought is like, what day is today and what do I have to do? And it takes just a split second for it for me to really be cognizant of the fact that my entire life is different now than anything I anticipated, but I don't remember it when I wake up. And then by the end of the day, every day, I think I'm just overwhelmed with frustration or sadness or something every day. And I think just that it's like a Groundhog Day feeling. And I think to me, there's an absurdity in just that split second in the morning where I'm not yet conditioned enough to this pandemic world, and I kind of forget it. And I wish I could hold that moment actually a little bit longer, but I can't. And so, that I can't just do all of the things that we take for granted. I think so many things that I've taken for granted before, and that goes away for a split second when I wake up, and I guess that feels absurd to me. It certainly feels meaningless. So.
In the move towards meaningless there and the absurdity, I want to come back to a couple of things that have come up in the Q&A. First of all, the very first comment or question came from Norma, who wanted to compliment Dr. Johnson on having the socks in the LR red and black. So did want to make sure we got that in. But really three questions that I think are so interrelated and probably make a great place for us to wrap up this evening. Amy Cloyd Palmer writes, I'm going to give the second part of hers first because I think it's interesting, but it's the first part that I really want to come to. The more recent book, Station 11, highlights the enduring nature of the arts following a pandemic as a traveling band of Shakespeare actors entertain the remaining people. So I'll throw that one out there for reading for folks. Station 11 sounds pretty cool. The first part of her question, though, was this. In the 1947 book, Earth Abides by George Stewart, a pandemic creates circumstances for nature to reassert itself. How can pandemic literature illustrate the place or role of humans on planet Earth? So I think that's taking us in kind of a sustainability direction. But there are two other questions that I want to weave together with this one by Hani Nassar and the other by Mason Seegers. The first, if literature can explain what is happening to us, do you feel that reading relevant literature cannot help us not only to cope with the pandemic, but keep us safe or even heal us? Mm-hmm. And Mason's question is along the same lines. During times like this, people are relying on science and religion to give them a sense of hope and peace. My question is, would it be absurd to rely on literature and the arts to give you that same sense of hope and peace? So to end, kind of three questions that deal with this. What does literature tell us about our place and the role of hope?
Wow, that's a lot. I think
in 2 minutes.
2 minutes, yes.
I think it can tell us any number of things, really depending on who we read. And that's one of the brilliant things about literature. And I certainly hope it's not absurd to think that, it can provide us with some kind of solace or some kind of, not necessarily escapism, but an ability to deal with some of these things. It certainly does for me, because I think we have access through literature, through philosophy, through religion, to the thinking of people who have different experiences than we've had, and who may be just smarter than we are and better at putting together ideas. And so it does allow us, I think, an opportunity to rethink things, to give us a perspective that we may have been lacking. And I think that's both on the human side, and to get to the initial, I think, question there, but also on the ecological front as well. What is a world that is drastically changed because of a virus? What does it look like? What's our role in it? Those worlds have been imagined and they're out there. And I think it's a good thing that we have access to them. And I find it not absurd at all, to go to a bookshelf to at least in some ways to try to deal with this.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Fisher.
I want to get this comment from the YouTube channel because I think it makes a nice transition to what we've got coming for next week, actually. So before we thank our guest tonight, Catherine Chandler writes, is there a pair of socks that says, I am other people's hell? And I'm guessing
honesty. Oh my gosh.
If there's not, that might be a place for entrepreneurship, which it taps into the what's coming next week, which is economics in the pandemic. So if there isn't, make it, market it. Dr. Newton, I'll hand it back over to you for kind of wrap up.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Makant. It's really been a pleasure to have this conversation here with you this evening. And as Dr. Fisher alluded to, next week we'll be joined by Dr. Tunai Oguz, who is one of our fantastic professors of economics here at Lenore-Ryan. And we're really looking forward to continuing on our interdisciplinary exploration. So we've done some humanities, we're going to go back to some social sciences, more humanities down the line in the future, all kinds of good stuff to look forward to in the coming weeks. Thank you all so much for joining us.